Hey everyone, it's the Geeky Gamer. I recently played through Deltarune while skipping all dialogue. Don't ask, it was for a video idea that I determined was too stupid halfway through writing the script. But I noticed a few things during the playthrough that I wanted to share, so this footage and time doesn't go to waste. So, here's some random things I noticed in Deltarune. During this playthrough, I tried to play through every battle with violence, since I was playing from the perspective of a hypothetical player who skips all dialogue, including Rousey's tutorial, so they don't learn how to spare enemies. This led to me learning a lot more about fighting with violence, since all my past playthroughs have been full pacifist, or at least as pacifist as I could. Heck, on my first run of chapters 3 and 4, I first tried to spare the Knight and the Titan. Yeah. Anyway, a neat quality of life feature of the battle system: if you have multiple party members attack an enemy in one turn, but the first hit, or two, depletes their health to 0, the other hits, or just one, will automatically go to the next enemy on the board. There's nothing else I specifically noticed in Chapter 1, so going into Chapter 2, you're forced to check out the rooms Rousey made for Chris and Susie before you can leave Castletown. Although, you only actually have to go into Susie's room, you can completely skip Chris's room. When Sweet, Cap'n, and KK heal back to full with literally just silk almond milk, there's actually unique dialogue for each one if they go down. Though I'm not sure what would happen if 2 or all 3 of them had their health depleted and healed on the same turn. One of the few segments with unskippable dialogue is Chris and Noelle's walk through the city, the buttons that spell December, as Noelle talks about when they would explore around town with Des and Azrael. This is one of the things I was specifically trying to find with my skip all dialogue run. This is unskippable, so it's probably very important. Either that or dialogue skipping is disabled because you're walking around while it's playing. When Susie takes the box off of Noelle's head, the box appears by itself when in Susie's hands, but when she throws it up, it suddenly gets Noelle's antlers poking out the top. If you defeat one Swatchling in a group of 3 that causes the other 2 to match, this won't satisfy the usual spare condition of having them all match color. However, defeating a second will still make the last remaining Swatchling tired, and able to be pacified. Not that that'll do any good, since you'd have lost the ability to recruit Swatchlings already. I don't know how many people have actually seen Task Manager's attack patterns. I think this was my first time seeing them, since I usually do her portrait quiz. Her whip sends out less zaps when her tasks are with her, and many more when she's alone. I really don't think I've seen this Swatchling attack, where one bounces around the bullet box. The wiki says that only blue Swatchlings do this, while the other 2 attacks are done by 2 colors each. And since blue is on an extreme end of the color spectrum for Swatchlings, most people probably won't cultify all the way to blues. This is the rarest Swatchling attack. Rules on the Thrash Machine can be defeated with violence on turn 3, maybe earlier with better weapons. I landed perfect hits with the Mecha Saber and Rager 2 and knocked him down to 59% health in one turn. The cutscene where Rousey explains the roaring is unskippable, unlike his similar cutscene explaining the legend at the start of Chapter 1. Is the roaring more important than the legend? Once you leave the library, there's actually nothing stopping you from going straight home instead of back to Castletown. If you start heading to the next street up, Susie will suggest checking on Lancer, since he should be back in the school closet, but you can just ignore this. At the start of Chapter 3, you can't skip Susie and Rousey's dialogue about Susie wanting Rousey to come to the light world, maybe because it's while walking around. Also, most of Rousey's cutscene about the nature of darkness is skippable, except for when he talks about how things become indistinct in the dark because your eyes can't see the truth, and when he starts trying to say that he's not real, though that second one has its text play slower for dramatics, especially since Susie stops him. When fighting Lenino and El Nina, if you don't say I love TV and just attack, one of them will eventually just ask whose attack you like better, rather than seemingly being prompted by one of them being acted to more. There's a through-line gag about Tenna calling these falling rocks, rocks, then shifting to calling them peaches, which continues into the island board where he apologizes for the lack of them, because he says they expired. Following Tenna's orders while you're captured and saying that you love TV isn't enough, as he wants you to say it like you mean it, so you'll just end the battle and enter another one with Tenna and a zapper that you'll need to use the off button on. Going through the backstage areas of TV World is a lot emptier if you've been fighting instead of sparing. The Shadow guys whose contracts normally shred are all missing, the Darkness live stage is deserted, nobody joins the fun gangs, they sneak around in the long sneaking path, and the room where you fight Rules is also deserted. Even if you fail to press 3 Lancer buttons in a single turn against Rules, Lancer will still be able to add 20% to the mercy meter. While fighting Tenna with violence, he only gave me bullet patterns until I knocked him under 50% health, at which point he replaced bullet patterns with forced minigames. At 40% health, he started making the Dole features, and it seems that at about 20% health, he initiates his big final episode attack. There's something else interesting about the Tenna fight. A lot of people know that Chris deals half the normal damage to the Knight, likely because they're sort of working with the Knight. However, I noticed that Chris also deals far less damage to Tenna than Susie or Rousey. During this fight, Chris had the Mecha Saber, Susie had the Auto Axe, and Rousey had the Rager 2, and Chris was dealing just over half as much damage as Rousey, because their damage is halved during this fight. Maybe they're not as willing to hurt Tenna, or were they stalling for the Knight? I found out that Chris's damage also gets tripled from their base damage if you've completed the sword route. I checked to see if Chris's damage increases on a normal route if Susie and or Rousey go down, like in the Knight fight, but their damage stays halved. One of the things I was interested in by doing this run of not talking to anyone I didn't have to was the sudden appearances of some of the returning Undertale characters. Unless you talk to her in the hometown segments of chapters 1 and 2, Undyne's only appearances are a quick one in the drive to school cutscene, and her suddenly showing up after the Knight fight, before getting kidnapped and suddenly becoming a somewhat major part of the plot. Imagine what that would be like for someone who didn't talk to her and didn't know anything about her. Lastly, Chapter 4. Just like with Undyne, imagine the surprise of Asgore showing up out of nowhere, with his only prior appearance that the player will absolutely see being his silhouette while Tenna's talking just before his fight. Seeing as there's hints that he's likely playing a major role in Chapter 5, it's a good idea to introduce him now if the player hasn't already met him. Another case of unskippable dialogue is whoever Chris is talking to on the phone, though that might be because it plays slower and shakier for dramatic effect, and isn't in a normal text box, so maybe that isn't compatible with the dialogue skipping feature. After leaving the holiday house, you can head right to the church instead of going back home to find the door locked, which would lead you to the church anyway. If you haven't gone back to Castletown yet and get to the screen that the hospital and library are on, Susie will mention that you haven't seen Rousey yet today, and suggests going to school to check on him, but you can say nah and keep going to the church, and Susie says she'll just go to Castletown herself later. I really think there's just some incompatibility between dialogue skipping and unusual text speeds, because Susie's slower dialogue of, "I don't think they're having choir practice," can't be skipped. I might be mistaken about the compatibility with skipping dialogue in scenes where it plays while walking, as there's dialogue that plays while walking in Chapter 4 that can be skipped. Maybe it's not as important? If you defeat a Mizzle encounter with violence in the room with all the water coolers, when coming back through after Susie gets the sheet music, there are less water coolers and no Mizzles floating around them. Another wrench in figuring out why some dialogue can't be skipped while moving is when Chris and Susie climb a pillar, while Susie reflects on her growth into a hero written in the prophecy. Though this dialogue might not be skippable because the climbing gameplay uses the standard interact button to charge jump, which usually progresses dialogue. Susie mistaking the Sound of Justice, the living Hammer of Justice statue, for Gerson really doesn't make as much sense if you haven't done the Hammer of Justice secret boss, except for the fact that it's first spotted near Gerson's study. Something that happened on my first playthrough back in June, I had an encounter with some organics, and had Susie use S action on one of them, in which she plays random notes. However, the 3 notes I got...
Was that the start of Megalovania?
Yeah, that sounded awfully similar to Megalovania, and I also thought it sounded similar to the social media notification sound in Undertale. I went back afterwards to do that act several more times, but never got anything other than more random notes, and the 3 notes didn't truly sound like either thing I thought they were, so they really are just random. The Titan spawn can be defeated with violence, even if Chris doesn't have the black shard, but it will take a while. Attacking with all 3 party members still using Chapter 2 weapons, I was able to knock down 14 to 17% health each turn, and Rude Buster didn't change that much. Believe it or not, it's entirely possible to defeat the first phase of the Titan fight without ever using Unleash, and just attacking it while its shield is up. However, be prepared for a long, boring war of attrition, as full perfect hits with Chapter 2 weapons knocked down 1% of its health. Chris and Rousey were dealing around 80 damage, and Susie was dealing around 100. And the damage seems to drop off a bit more than usual if you don't land perfect hits. Landing Susie's hit just before or after the perfect timing dropped it down to around 80 damage. Throwing in a Rude Buster whenever possible helps, as it was dealing up to about 190 damage for me, and along with perfect hits from Chris and Rousey, dropped the Titan's health by 2%. Yeah, get strapped in if you decide to go this route. The upside is that you won't encounter the Titan's harder attacks when its shield is down, so you can just focus on mastering the cycle of 3 easier attacks and get TP for more Rude Busters and heal prayers. It took me 17 minutes to deplete 50% of the Titan's health, which is what triggers it to regenerate back to full health before Gerson shows up for the final phase. You can't win with violence in the final phase though. I looked it up and it will just regenerate upon reaching 50% health again. You have to use Jewel Buster and Susie's idea to finish the fight. Also, Gerson showing up at the end in his Hammer of Justice armor and wielding his hammer. I can personally attest to seeing this without knowing about a secret boss fight.
He is over on Smog!
You can walk right past Rousey without talking to him after Susie sees and breaks the final part of the prophecy, so you can skip the chance to tell him it's okay not to smile. Safe to say, I won't be doing that again. The place where it rained, it takes so long to get to the first actual note that you can get back home before recognizing the first note from it's raining somewhere else. Speaking of a Sans-related song, Sans showing up at the end of the Chapter 4 is the first time the player is guaranteed to see him. Even more than Undyne and Asgore, I bet this would be a huge shock to anyone who didn't see him before now. And that's everything I noticed on this playthrough, plus a few extras. I don't know if I'll make another one of these, it all depends on if I notice anything else, but I probably won't make another one. But, one last thing I learned. Trying to make a video about making sense of what plot points you'll see even if you skip everything else in a dialogue-heavy game that I already know the story of, is a really stupid idea. I'm the Geeky Gamer, see ya!